Before the story begins, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe so this channel can keep growing and bring you even more compelling stories. They say a mother's instinct is to protect her child at all costs. But in my family, I was the cost. I am standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse in Silicon Valley, looking out at the city lights. It should be quiet tonight. But a glaring red alert is flashing rhythmically across my monitors. Someone is currently attempting to commit massive identity theft against me to secure a high-risk loan. The IP address isn't from a nameless hacker halfway across the world, though. It is traced directly to my mother's living room. The rhythmic flashing of the red security alert on my monitor pulls me back, dragging me into a past I thought I had permanently deleted. It brings back the suffocating smell of our cramped Manhattan apartment, a place where my very existence felt like a system error. Growing up, my mother, Nora, and my stepfather, Richard, treated parenting less like raising a family and more like managing a high-stakes financial portfolio. They poured every ounce of their energy and their limited wealth into Stella. Stella, my older half-sister, was radiant, fiercely charming, and entirely obsessed with appearances. She was their blue-chip stock, groomed for the absolute peak of high society, draped in the finest boutique clothes they could barely afford. I, on the other hand, was the bad investment, the quiet mistake. I spent my teenage years tucked away in the darkest, coldest corner of our shared room. I taught myself to code on a salvaged, overheating laptop with a cracked screen. Society often romanticizes the concept of family, assuming parents love their children equally and unconditionally. But psychology paints a much darker, much more transactional reality. Many parents operate with a narcissistic, conditional love. They funnel all their available resources into the child they believe will bring them the greatest social return, and completely discard the one who refuses to fit their mold. The tragic irony is that this toxic dynamic eventually destroys both children. The pampered child is completely stripped of their basic survival skills, having every single obstacle conveniently cleared for them, while the neglected child, the outcast, is forced to develop an impenetrable armor of self-reliance. While Stella was handed the keys to a brand new luxury car she didn't even know how to maintain, I was navigating the subway at midnight, working late shifts at a local tech repair shop just to buy used programming textbooks. They never saw my late nights mastering complex algorithms as ambition. To them, it was an embarrassment. Nora would stand in the doorway, look at my glowing screen with a contorted face, and tell me I was wasting my life, that I would always be in Stella's shadow. The final thread of my tolerance snapped on a humid night during my last year of college. Nora had orchestrated an extravagant dinner party to celebrate Stella's latest venture, a vaporware cosmetics brand that had no actual product, existing entirely on social media hype. The apartment was packed with their pretentious friends, the air thick with cheap perfume and loud fake laughter. During dessert, Richard stood up and proudly announced that he was taking out a $250,000 second mortgage to personally fund Stella's massive launch. The entire room erupted in applause. Stella beamed, soaking in the endless validation. I sat at the very edge of the table, my hands sweating against the fabric of my cheap jeans. I had just finished writing the core architecture for my first AI security protocol. I just needed a tiny fraction of support to get it off the ground. When the applause finally died down, I took a deep breath. I looked at Richard and quietly asked if they could simply co-sign a $2,000 bank loan, so I could rent the servers I desperately needed for testing. The silence in the room was deafening. Richard slowly put down his crystal wine glass. He sized me up with a look of absolute disgust. He laughed, a cold, hollow, cruel sound that echoed off the dining room walls. He looked around at the guests and announced that I was a delusional parasite, a complete failure begging for handouts while my sister was building a real empire. Nora didn't defend me. She just shook her head, her face turning red, and whispered that I was ruining their perfect evening. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just stood up, pushed my heavy wooden chair in and walked straight to my room. That night, while the party raged on, I packed my entire life into a single worn-out duffel bag. I quietly walked out the front door, leaving my house keys on the kitchen counter. I stepped out into the freezing Manhattan streets with absolutely nothing to my name, but as the cold air hit my face, for the first time in my life I could finally breathe. Walking away from that apartment was the most terrifying, yet liberating moment of my life. I didn't look back. I slept on a friend's couch for weeks, living off instant noodles, pouring every single ounce of my pain into my code. Then Julian found my project online. He wasn't some arrogant venture capitalist looking for a quick payout. He was an angel investor who actually understood the complex architecture I was building. He didn't care about my lack of a pedigree or my family's social status. He just saw the raw, undeniable brilliance in the data. We started the company in a damp, unheated garage in Queens. Those days were grueling. Long, silent nights illuminated only by the harsh blue glow of our monitors. We drank cheap, bitter coffee and wrote lines of code until our fingers went completely numb. We were building an AI cybersecurity platform that would eventually revolutionize the entire tech industry. Society often aggressively condemns children who completely cut ties with their parents. People call it cruel. They call it ungrateful. But no one teaches you how to survive when your own home is the very thing eroding your soul. In therapy, going no contact with a profoundly toxic family isn't a weapon of punishment. It is a matter of life and death. It is emergency emotional first aid. You simply cannot heal in the exact same environment that broke you in the first place. My relentless drive in that freezing garage wasn't fueled by some desperate, bitter need for revenge. It was born the exact second I stopped wasting my energy trying to prove my worth to people who intentionally kept their eyes closed. When you finally stop knocking on a door that will never ever open, you can use your own hands to build your own house. And that is exactly what Julian and I did. We built a digital fortress. We secured massive government contracts, and our little startup evolved into a multi-billion-dollar empire. Fast forward to the present. While my life was quietly ascending into the peaceful security of Silicon Valley, the fragile, glamorous house of cards my mother and Richard had built was rapidly collapsing. Stella's vaporware cosmetics brand imploded, just as predictably as my algorithms could have forecasted. Without a tangible product, the hollow social media hype vanished overnight. The furious investors pulled out, and that massive $250,000 second mortgage Richard proudly took out to fund her vanity project? It defaulted. The bank was aggressively moving in to seize all their assets. Their superficial world of luxury, designer clothes, and pretentious dinner parties was evaporating into thin air. Desperation makes people incredibly dangerous. A few weeks ago, while Nora was frantically packing moving boxes in their soon-to-be foreclosed apartment, she stumbled across a recent issue of Forbes magazine. And there, staring back at her from the cover, was the daughter she had publicly called a parasite. Me, hailed as a billionaire AI engineer. Did she call me to apologize? Did she reach out to finally make amends for a lifetime of neglect? No. She looked at that magazine cover and saw me the exact same way she always had. As a financial asset to be exploited. She meticulously gathered my old social security number, my birth certificate, and the dormant digital footprints I had left behind in my childhood bedroom. She devised a desperate plan to steal my identity and secure a massive high-risk shadow loan to save Stella's sinking ship. She thought I was still that quiet, naive girl who wouldn't fight back. Which brings me back to tonight. Standing in the absolute silence of my penthouse, watching this glaring red alert flash across my monitors. The red alert on my screen was still pulsing rhythmically when the private elevator chime echoed through the penthouse. My security concierge downstairs had just announced two uninvited guests, Nora and Stella. I could have easily turned them away, left them standing on the cold pavement. But I needed to see this play out to the very end. I authorized their entry. When the polished steel doors finally slid open, they stepped into my living room. Their eyes immediately darted around, aggressively taking in the vaulted ceilings, the custom artwork, the panoramic views of the bay. The exact life they had repeatedly told me I would never ever have. Nora looked disheveled. Her usual pristine, arrogant posture was completely replaced by a calculated, pathetic slouch. Stella was right behind her, clutching a designer tissue, her eyes perfectly red, as if she had been practicing the look in the rearview mirror all morning. I calmly gestured for them to sit. They sank into the massive custom Italian leather sofa, looking incredibly small and out of place. Nora began the performance immediately. She leaned forward, her voice trembling with a heavily manufactured grief. She told me how much they had missed me, How Richard was practically on his deathbed from the crushing stress of their financial ruin. Stella chimed in, letting out a soft, fragile sob, whispering that she had lost absolutely everything, and that family needs to stick together in the darkest of times. They didn't mention the massive shadow loan. They didn't mention the federal identity theft they were attempting at that very exact moment from a laptop they had left open in their apartment. They just sat there in my home, spinning a complex web of apologies they didn't mean, begging for a financial lifeline under the convenient guise of maternal love. I sat across from them, my hands resting quietly in my lap. I didn't interrupt. I just let the heavy silence hang in the air after Nora finished her desperate plea. The air was thick with their unspoken desperation. I looked at the two women who had treated me like a broken piece of hardware my entire life, now sitting in my digital fortress, begging for a system reboot. When the hollow echoes of their fake sobs finally died down in the massive room, I let out a slow, deliberate breath. I didn't yell. I didn't scream or call them liars. I simply reached over to the glass coffee table and picked up my laptop. I turned the screen around so it faced them directly. The glaring red security alert cast a harsh, unforgiving light on Nora's pale face. I watched her eyes narrow as she tried to comprehend the complex lines of code and the flashing federal banking insignias. I spoke softly, but my voice cut through the room like shattered glass. I told her that 4 years ago, when I first built my security architecture, I placed a permanent, impenetrable freeze on my federal credit profile. I explained that the system currently blinking on my screen had detected a massive, high-risk loan application using my social security number exactly 3 hours ago. Nora's mouth fell open, the color completely drained from Stella's cheeks. I leaned forward, looking my mother dead in the eyes. I told her that my AI didn't just block the fraudulent transaction. It bypassed their cheap VPN and traced the IP address straight back to her living room router in Manhattan. And worse, it automatically captured and encrypted every single forged document, every fake signature, and every fraudulent keystroke she had desperately submitted. I tapped the keyboard once, and a locked, heavily encrypted folder appeared on the center of the screen. I explained that those files were now completely frozen as undeniable, legally binding evidence of major financial fraud. The silence in the penthouse was absolute. It was deafening. The calculated, pitiful tears completely vanished from their faces, replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. They hadn't come here to apologize. They had come here to keep me distracted while the loan processed. They thought I was still that naive, disposable little girl coding in the dark corner of their apartment. They didn't realize they had just tried to hack into a system designed by the very person they had ruthlessly trained to survive. The trap they built for me had flawlessly and permanently closed around their own necks. Nora's legs simply gave out. The pristine, arrogant woman who had spent my entire childhood treating me like a defective burden physically collapsed onto my expensive rug. She began to weep uncontrollably, her tears ruining her carefully applied makeup. She reached out, her hands shaking violently, trying to grab the hem of my trousers. She stammered out a barrage of desperate, fractured apologies, words that echoed hollowly against the glass walls of my penthouse. She pleaded with me to remember the bond of blood. She used the title of motherhood as her final, ultimate shield. She cried that despite all her terrible mistakes, she was still the woman who gave me life. Then her voice dropped into a pathetic, broken whisper. She revealed that Richard had suffered a massive heart attack the moment the bank served the foreclosure papers. She told me he was currently lying in a sterile hospital bed, fighting for his life, and they had absolutely zero funds to cover his essential medical treatments. She begged me to just release the frozen loan, to just turn a blind eye this one time for the sake of a dying man. Stella sat completely frozen on the sofa, her earlier theatrics completely gone, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. I looked down at my mother, feeling a profound, heavy emptiness. There was no anger left in my chest. There was no desperate need for revenge. Just a cold, undeniable clarity. There is a deeply ingrained misconception in our society. A toxic belief that being a good, moral person means you must endlessly forgive and financially rescue anyone who shares your DNA. People will tell you that turning your back on a weeping mother is an act of unforgivable cruelty. But true, profound compassion must always be paired with razor-sharp wisdom. When you are faced with lifelong manipulators who suddenly use the word family as an emotional ransom note, Handing them a check is not an act of saving them. It is an act of sheer enabling. It is actively funding their rot. The absolute worst kind of forgiveness is the kind that allows toxic people to avoid the consequences of their own destructive choices. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't step back. I calmly leaned down and looked directly into Nora's tear-streaked face. I told her that the fraud evidence would remain permanently locked, and that I would not unfreeze the loan application. I would not give Stella a single dime to save her from the financial ruin she built with her own 2 hands. Nora let out a sharp, devastated gasp. But before she could launch into another hysterical plea, I held up my hand, stopping her dead in her tracks. I told her I would do exactly one thing. I would personally instruct my wealth management team to contact Richard's hospital directly. I would establish a highly secure, automated trust fund that would exclusively cover his medical bills, his surgeries, and his recovery treatments. The payments would be wired directly to the hospital administration. Not a single cent of my money would ever touch her bank accounts, and absolutely nothing would pass through Stella's hands. Stella suddenly jumped up from the sofa, her face red with panic. She argued that they needed money for living expenses, that they were about to be evicted onto the street. I looked at my sister with absolute zero emotion. I told her that surviving the real world was a lesson she should have learned a long time ago. Setting up that medical trust was not about saving their glamorous lifestyle. It was about preserving my own humanity. It was the ultimate boundary of an emotionally independent adult. I can protect my own morality and show mercy to a sick man without ever sacrificing myself to your endless, consuming greed. I stood up, walked back to my desk, and pressed the small silver security button. I looked at the 2 women who had spent my entire life trying to break me. I told them they came here today looking for a naive victim to exploit. But they were leaving with absolute clarity. You do not have access to my resources, you do not have access to my identity, and you will never again have access to my peace. The heavy steel doors of the private elevator slid open. My security team stepped quietly into the room. I turned my back to them, looking out the glass windows at the city lights. As my mother and my sister were escorted out of my home, and out of my life forever. The heavy steel doors of the elevator closed, and just like that, the suffocating presence of my past was gone. I walked slowly back to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city lights of San Francisco were glittering below, a vast sea of endless possibilities. I turned my attention back to my monitors. The glaring red security alert had completely vanished. In its place, lines of complex, elegant code were streaming smoothly across the black screens. It was a perfect, flawless system. For so many years, I had allowed toxic variables to disrupt my life. People who acted like malicious bugs, constantly draining my energy, constantly trying to crash everything I had built. But tonight, I didn't just quarantine the threat, I permanently deleted it. You cannot rewrite the beginning of your story, and you cannot choose the family you were born into. But you hold the absolute power to program your own future. I took a deep, steady breath of the quiet air in my penthouse. There was no more tension. There were no more expectations to meet, and no more apologies to fake. The system is finally clean, and the silence is absolutely perfect.